Hello, everybody, and welcome to week two of the Future Founders Program, hosted by myself and Open UK. Open UK is the UK organization for open technology, so that includes open source software, open hardware, and open data. And our purpose is UK leadership and international collaboration in open technology. My name is Matt Barker. I'm the Open UK's entrepreneur in residence. I've started my own open source business about 7 or 8 years ago now in the containerization and Kubernetes space. I went through an exit myself and am now part of a larger organization based in the US. We've got a fantastic set of panelists today, and we're going to talk about product market fit and developing a product in open source businesses. So what we want people to come away from today with, well, we'd like them to understand what the difference is in building a product in open source versus proprietary, what they might need to do in order to be successful in developing a product in open source, and some of the issues they might be able to avoid. We're also interested in people joining the mentorship program. So if you're interested in that, where you can get one-to-one help and advice from a number of the experts that you're going to be getting to know during the process of this program, then please go to openuk.uk/founders forum and sign up there. So thank you very much to my panelists today. We have a wonderful selection of people who've got great experience and expertise in running and building open source businesses. Firstly, we have Justin Cormack. He's the CTO of Docker, which actually was probably one of the main reasons why I got into the container space, which was Docker itself, and started a business around it, specifically Kubernetes. But Justin serves on the technical oversight board of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. He's been involved in the open source community for many, many years and has worked in publishing and financial services as well as many software startups. He's been focusing on supply chain security and container and cloud native software delivery as an engineer and executive. Someone I've known for a long, long time because he used to hang around in the Canonical offices back 10 to 15 years ago. So welcome, Justin. Great to have you with us. We also have Sam Weaver. Sam is the CEO at Plural Labs. It's a venture-backed startup that empowers DevOps teams to effortlessly deploy and operate production-ready open source applications from day one. Sam has spent over a decade in open source, having held engineering, architect, and product management roles at Red Hat and MongoDB. Most recently, Sam was head of product at Unqork and the No-Code Enterprise Application platform. And Sam and I worked together for a good number of years back at MongoDB. Welcome, Sam. Great to have you with us. We also have Tom Wilkie. Tom is VP of Technology at Grafana Labs and a Prometheus, Cortex, and Loki maintainer, and serves on the governing board of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Previously, Tom founded Causal, which was a company working on Prometheus, and then Akunu, previous to that, which focused on Cassandra. He's previously worked at companies such as Weaveworks, Google, and ZenSource, and in his spare time, Tom likes to make craft beer and build 3D printers, and as I know, he also likes fast cars. Welcome, Tom. Great to have you with us. And finally, but no means by least, we have Fiona Nielsen. Fiona is the CEO of O2H Technology and founder of DNA Digest and Repositive, which is a bioinformatics scientist turned entrepreneur. Repositive is known as the biggest platform for preclinical CROs offering translational oncology models and services, which I don't really know exactly what that means, but hopefully we'll find out. The Repositive cancer model platform is serving the biopharma community worldwide to speed up their sourcing of cancer models and ensuring confidence in selecting the right model for every study. She also founded DNA Digest, which is a charity to promote best practices for efficient and ethical data sharing, aligning the interests of patients and researchers. Welcome, Fiona. So what I'd like to start with, which worked quite well last week, is really just to explore how participants got into open source. I think there's going to be a lot of people out there that are interested in getting into the space and possibly interested, hopefully, in looking at starting a business in the area. So Justin, could you kick us off and talk a little bit about how you actually got into open source originally?
Yeah, so I started using Linux kind of fairly early on in the I think with the late 90s, and I carried on using Linux for a long time as just as a user for various projects. And then I was working in a startup I founded and needed some weird drivers for some embedded stuff we were doing, and I started working. I thought, well, I'll work out how to do this, and so I started contributing to Linux, and that and And so that was kind of my first introduction to working with open source. I was, I had really great mentorship, and then I carried on, working in businesses that used open source pretty much ever since, and produced open source.
Did you actively search out those companies that were using open source, or was that just a happy coincidence?
Um, I think actually most early on it was more a coincidence. I think more recently there's very few companies, certainly in the space I work in, that don't use open source or produce open source. So, um, but yeah, it's something that I think is once you understand how open source businesses work, you understand what the advantages are, and you want to keep having those advantages.
Well, hopefully we'll dig into some of those in a minute. Just before I move on to Tom, just a quick reminder: if you want to ask any questions, please do put them in the chat, either in the general group or just directly to me. It might be even easier so that I can pick the right questions for the right time. So please stick them in the chat if you've got any questions. Over to you, Tom. How did you get into open source?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It was actually, I was super lucky at university. I worked with the Zen project, the hypervisor that later went on to be used by Amazon to build EC2. And I did a summer internship and got involved that way. I then eventually joined ZenSource as a software engineer, and that was really kind of a baptism of fire in open source. I think it was, after that, with Cassandra as well, kind of learning about, the Apache community and how projects kind of go through that life cycle of incubation and get adopted by foundations. That was really a kind of a steep learning curve. Google, not really a huge amount of open source work there as an SRE, but post Google, funnily enough, getting into the kind of Docker and Kubernetes side of things was really when kind of I got much more engaged and started thinking about and how to build products using open source technology.
Wow, so you actually explored and did an internship using open source software then, so for those people that are at university right now, was that a difficult thing to convince your lecturers of, or how did you find an internship around open source software?
It was a long time ago. I mean, I was super.
I didn't ask you specifically when that was. Just I didn't want to give away your age, but
I mean, it was my director of studies at university was the chap who started the Zen project. So, I think I just lucked into it. Really,
that's very lucky. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, just personal sort of point to make that actually we have a number of interns at JetStack, and there are some great hubs now for open source technology. I think Southampton's one, Bristol we work quite closely with, and Imperial. So yeah, that's probably it's got much better than it used to be. So there's a lot more programs around that, which I can point people to if they're interested in joining the mentorship program. Fiona, over to you. How did you get involved in open source?
Thank you. I came into open source from the academic side of things. So after studying computer science, I went into bioinformatics and genomics. And when you're into the computational side of things, at least when you're bioinformatics, it's very much about building tools and publishing those tools that you use to do your science, and which immediately means that you're sharing your tools, which means that you're sharing the software, which means that you're sharing the code. So it's sort of the the necessity of making your tools available and making them so other scientists can build upon those tools have been my starting point into open source. And then when I later went from academia into industry and later became an entrepreneur and started a company, it seemed like the right thing to do when building software for scientists, that we're also supporting the open source community around that.
And did you understand or know about open source before you started sharing that data? I mean, or was it just something you did naturally, sharing it between scientists?
In science, in the last 10 years, there's also been a movement towards open access to journals, open access to research results, open access to data, which I've played a very active part in that. So it seemed like a natural it's not even something that was consciously on my mind at the time. It's just an obvious thing. Of course, you also share the code to the tools that you share so that people can build upon them and understand what you're doing.
Because opening it creates better outcomes. So it's not even like a thing that we should be thinking about almost. But yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Fiona. Sam, can you explain a bit about how you got into open?
Yeah, so I have a computer science degree. I studied at Cardiff, and luckily we had a program with IBM where IBM would take on a student a year in sort of like the summer program. I was fortunate enough to go be part of that program. Wasn't a whole lot of open source work there. I was working on mainframes. Pretty interestingly enough, working on mainframes for a summer. And what I was studying as a major was distributed systems and mobile networks. So it felt like to me working on mainframes and what I was actually studying and interesting didn't quite align up. So I was sort of looking around for, okay, who's doing something interesting in what is now more decentralized compute space, cloud is emerging, and in and around the London area. And it happened to be Red Hat was based just outside of Farnborough. So I applied to Red Hat. And I was fortunate enough I got in. I started working for the first couple of years as an engineer in internal systems, still using a bunch of open source to be able to build those internal systems. And then later on transitioned into an architect role externally, working with customers and prospects to basically make Red Hat software successful. And of course, loved it. Red Hat went through its sort of first major milestone of becoming $1 billion revenue open source company. And I thought, hey, this is a much better way to build a business with a fantastic product. And how do I stay a part of that ecosystem?
It's added a few more billions since then, I believe.
Yeah, for sure.
You started obviously on the customer side, but then obviously you moved into product. How did you transition from customer to product facing?
It's a great question. It's actually pretty natural. And I don't mean in particular for me, I think just anybody working on the customer front. Ultimately, somebody as a product person, you are the voice of the customer. And so what I was doing, unbeknownst to me, when I moved to MongoDB, I was actually a pre-sales architect. And so doing a lot of sort of like early deals with potential clients or customers, getting them successful with the product. You hear a lot of reasons why people can't be successful. You hear a lot of reasons of it's not going to work unless I have a particular feature. I'm trying to solve a particular problem that you guys don't address. And so you can sit on that information and not do anything with it, move on, or you can give that feedback to the engineering team. And that's what I was doing, giving them very direct and guided feedback as to, hey, if we wanted to address a particular use case, I've got 4 other people saying the same thing, and this is how they're thinking about doing it. And so it turns out that that's actually quite a natural connection to make. And I ended up moving out to the US. I spent 8 years out in New York, basically working with the engineering teams to build those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for helping me make some of those sales back in MongoDB in those early days when you were that pre-sales engineer. So you certainly helped me a couple of times there. And obviously you made a point about the fact that open source software, your customers are already using that project or that open source. But that brings me on to my first question to the panelists. And how do people think about where the open source project starts and ends in relation to a product? Like what is the difference between the open source and a product in open source companies? Would anyone like to kick me off and try and help explain that may be point of confusion for some people?
Well,
Yeah, go on, Justin.
Okay, I think that the first thing is that the open source project is never the product. Like the open source project is, it's the GitHub repo and it's the pull requests and issues, but that's not something that people buy. When people buy something, they want something packaged that comes with guarantees, perhaps delivery. Like there's a whole set of things you can put around it, but you should never be thinking that the open source project sitting there on GitHub or wherever is actually a product at all, and that should always be your starting point.
I think it's really easy to confuse your users of your open source project with your customers as well. Like normally they're very different, and normally they have completely different needs, right? And a very different relationship. We found at Grafana, users are quite willing to invest in getting a lot out of the product and a project rather. Oh, I made a mistake. And configuring it and tweaking it and contributing and learning. Whereas the needs of a lot of our customers are for a much more turnkey experience, right? And that's opportunities to differentiate between the two.
So that suggests that there's different personas that you're creating features,
100%.
Features for. And I guess can some of you talk a little bit about the different types of personas you might be engaging with? Sam, do you wanna go?
Yeah, for sure. So in general, I mean, what's interesting for me about the people you're working with in the enterprise part of open source versus the general, call it, usage of the open source project. The what we had seen early days, for example, at MongoDB and even now at Plural, is you're getting people who are solving a variety of different problems, and they have 100 different ways to do it. And so being able to sort of bucket them into personas, you can really start to define what is the set of problems people are trying to solve for a particular persona, and you can start to build a roadmap around your product for addressing those persona pain points. And so everybody's going to always have their own unique-ish way of doing things, but generally if you look, there's overlapping themes. And so you can say, listen, okay, there's somebody who's operating this. What does an operator need to be successful at standing these kinds of things up? There's an end user. Who is my end user? Are they a data scientist? Are they a data engineer? Are they a developer? And what are the things that they are going to need to be successful? And as you think about sort of evolving the project, and to Justin's point, is sort of like turning it into a product. Generally, for me, is a project is normally solving a very specific problem for a persona, and you're gonna sort of generally keep it within that range. A product is saying, how do I holistically solve a bunch of pains across multiple roles, and who are those roles for which I'm addressing, and how do I make their lives easier? Often that's going to be the case when you're talking about open source in enterprise at scale.
Interesting. So when you talk about an open source project landing in the hands of your user base, do we tend to find that they're landing in prospective customers for the future, or do they tend to just be like individual enthusiasts playing around at home with their own servers or in the cloud with their own like personal instances or clusters? Fiona, how did you find people picking up the projects that you were involved in?
Well, it really depends on what kind of product you're delivering in what kind of industry, but it could be that even if your entire product, even if all the code in your product is open source, it might be that only part of the user base actually actively engaging with the open source part. The other users might just be using the product to solve a specific problem and not actively contributing to the open source or even investigating the source code. I mean, they could be just users of the product itself. So it's very important to understand which part of your user base have which kind of needs, because you also find different needs expressed by those who are looking into the source code and those who are just looking at the end result that they get in from the user interface. So in our experience with Repositive, because our user base were very academic, very sciencey scientists, it was mostly the part, the algorithmic part, the key of the calculations, for example. That's the part that the scientists want to scrutinize. What is exactly going on here? Whereas the rest, the whole user interface or whoever, that doesn't really matter much, but they would be really keen to look into the algorithmic part. And that would be also where it would be most advantage for us to open source it as soon as possible to make that piece available.
Interesting. Very interesting. And do you feel like for people who've gone through and actually created an open source project, are they thinking about the types of like product models that they're going to actually adopt later down the line? Or are you literally just trying to create a successful open source project? How have people seen that evolving nature between like the success of an open source project versus like later on down the line, the possibility perhaps of commercializing it? Any comment on that from...
I think a lot of people just start a project to scratch an itch, and that's the classic thing. Like, I have a problem, I want to solve it. I'll make it open source because it's convenient. It might solve a problem for someone else. You never know. But mainly, I'm doing it for myself to solve my own problem. And then after a bit, you discover, there are other people with the same problem. You discover that there's more nuance to the problem than you thought. You discover maybe there are a lot of other people who want to help solve the problem with you, and then your project starts taking off, and then you go there. It's not the only model, and there are people who start projects with the idea of starting a business at the same time. But I think it's I mean, literally just yesterday, I was hearing an origin story for an open source company based on that exact story of I scratched my itch in various companies I worked for several years, and then decided, hold on, there's a business in here. Let's think about this as a business now.
And some of those decisions, maybe if you are just scratching an itch, are there any decisions that potential founders should be thinking about when they're starting those projects around licensing or the way that they're structuring the, where they're putting the code, how they're distributing it, and any war stories around maybe making mistakes or doing something that wrong that people would have gone back and changed that they could have done? Tom, any advice there?
I think in the very early days, right, you've got to mostly drive to build as adoption, a big community. So finding licenses that make that easy, don't present any barrier. Apache is a great license for that kind of thing. Make it so that people can get started easily. Give them a one-line, installation instruction, or whatever it takes to make it easy to adopt. Like that's one of the mistakes we made with Cortex, is it was just too hard to get started with. And so making it easy to adopt. Later down the line, and famously, right, at Grafana Labs, we recently changed all our licenses to AGPL. Like you can make these changes, right? You can pivot to different business models and different licenses that help balance the kind of freedoms versus commercialization opportunities. But yes, at the beginning, try not to. I would go even more opinionated than Justin and say, yeah, I think most of the successful projects are things where you scratch your own itch and don't try and think about how to make money out of it just yet. Like think about how to build something that's actually valuable to begin with.
You also made a point that I really want to pick up on, because I really truly believe this. In my time in open source software businesses, it was Ubuntu, then it was MongoDB, and then it's been Kubernetes, and it's been Cert Manager. And more often than not, the most successful projects have been the easiest ones to actually engage with and get onboarded to, although they might not necessarily be the probably in some cases the best solution. Like I think just coming back to that point on making a project easy to engage with. Does anyone have any tips or ideas on how they can make it easy for developers to actually use that software? Fiona?
Well, as a business, you need to invest in the interface you have with your users, right? And if until they're onboarded, that interface might be the tutorials, the manuals, the documentation, anything that just helps describe what you got and how you get started. Think of that as a user experience as well. What is the user experience before they've seen your code, right? How do they get to know what you have, what you do, and how they can get engaged? And that's where, when you think of it from a business perspective and you think of, okay, who do you have on your team? That's the point where you need to think of, okay, maybe we need more than just hardcore developers on a team, because maybe we need someone who thinks about what do we look like from a marketing perspective? What do we look like from a user experience perspective? And that's where you really need to look at having the right skills on your team to make this successful.
A really good point. We should definitely come onto that in a bit. Sam, any comments from yourself?
I mean, I think Fiona hit the major points. This is often, I'll just say this: people love to be able to get the answer to whether something is going to solve their problem or not as quickly as possible. So if you make it awkward for them to get started, if you put a gate up, that's, let's organize a demo, or let's talk to sales or something like that, almost certainly somebody is going to go somewhere else for a solution. And so making sure the README is well documented, making sure, you have a container or something that's easy to get up and going with. You see a lot of people, obviously, with cloud services that's, click to get going and you're up and running instantly. Is like, those are the most successful models for people, is just to remove as much friction as you can.
And that's kind of where open source started its commercial popularity, because you could just try it and start using it, and then it would, become it. Developers much preferred that to the kind of model of having to go through salespeople and finding out that they didn't know how much it was going to cost their company. Whereas trying something out, building a prototype, that kind of thing, is really where open source got into the enterprise in the first place.
Yeah.
This kind of this grassroots adoption you see in enterprises, right? Often the managers and the directors of engineering don't know what open source projects are being used by their teams. Right. And actually kind of our sales job at Grafana is just to try and find out who's using Grafana and tell them, oh, did you know 20 teams in your company are using Grafana? Would you like some help with that?
Yeah. Well, how do you find that out? Obviously, proprietary software.
Right. So this is a controversial subject, isn't it? Yeah. Like, do you add tracking to open source software?
Yes. That is a question that I've had, or argument or pub chat or whatever it is, multiple times. So yeah, what is the answer? Just Tom, before we start on that and the answer to that, could you just explain for people's references what that actually means?
Right. So I mean, the question to ask yourself is, how do you know how many people are using your software? Right. And so you can look at Docker Hub downloads, GitHub stars, these kind of things. But at the end of the day, they're only proxies for the real number. And so especially a lot of commercial software, we'll ping home. We'll send some minimal amount of information back home at some regular occurrence to say, hey, I'm alive. And then you can use that statistics to count how many people are using your software. And it's a bit controversial to do that in open source, I'd say. We do it at Grafana Labs with most of our projects, but we take a lot of care over like what data we send home and where it goes. And we try and share the findings from that with the community. And that's the trade-off we've struck. I'm not saying it's the perfect solution for everyone, and some people are going to find that not a very good answer. But I like the fact that I can tell how many people are using Grafana and how many Grafana users use it with Prometheus or use it with Elastic or use it with other data sources, right? And we share this information so that everyone can learn together.
Any comment from any of the other panelists on that?
Yeah, so it might be depending, and again, this is depending on your business model, and I'm looking at this from a scientist perspective, where the open source is often provided in connection with some kind, either knowledge or database or some kind of information or value that you're presenting other than in addition to the open source, right? So in addition to the software itself, you have some kind of knowledge, and in those cases, then for the software in whichever place it resides to ping the main database to get the latest data or the latest update or the latest knowledge that is provided by this company makes perfect sense. And then that's a natural way of then seeing, okay, how many are actually pinging, well knowing that they're using your software to do it. But that's just a side note, that it's not always impossible. It just depends on what is the value you're contributing. And at least from my experience, the fact that you have some IP that is also not the software usually makes investors happy. So if that is the knowledge base or the whatever data is that you're providing in addition to the software, which remains with you, but people can ping it to get the latest statistics, for example, then that is something that's valuable, part of your IP as a company.
I mean, Tom mentioned Docker Hub downloads. I mean, we actually, we do sell people information about how many people are using their software and things from Docker Hub. So, I think there are third-party sources about things, even if you don't have direct telemetry, because we can tell, where people are downloading your software from and things like that. So I think there are other sources as well that are available.
I might have to contact you separately about some extra information from Docker Hub then, just because we know we have a lot of downloads. I mean, I think we have like more than almost 2 million a day Docker Hub pulls on Cert Manager. So, so maybe you could give me a bit more information. But I'd actually have a question in the background from Serdar, which is, I think it's connected in some ways to some of these conversations that we've been having up to this point, and that is the concept of a permissive license and opening your code is quite scary for a lot of people, because you might think that the competition are going to take it and fork it and then maybe create their own product around it. But on the other hand, obviously it's great because it gives you massive distribution, and obviously that's what I found. It was hugely beneficial for the success of my business, and it gives a great advantage in the fact you're going to get lots of people using it. Can people kind of like talk or elaborate or talk a little bit about like that sort of like line between overly permissive and sort of like keeping your cards close to your chest, possibly with the concept of like maybe further productizing or like creating competition for yourself on your own code, as it were? Does anyone have any like good pieces of advice around that? Sam, if you want to give us your opinions on that.
I mean, generally what we as a product person is I think two things. One is you normally have in your mind a set of direction that you're convinced is the way forward. So not only do you have the product, but you have the vision. Mm-hmm. You can put the product out there, unless somebody has the vision as well, it's not going to do too much. I think if you're solving a real true problem, people will latch onto it as a solution. Personally, I like the permissiveness of putting stuff out there. I think you actually innovate far, far quicker when it's permissive. That said, is if you choose to start permissive and realize over time you want to go more restrictive, it's very tough to pull off. It's almost better to start the other way around. So if you are thinking that there could be any reason, or you just don't have a clear vision around where you're headed, or you don't feel like the problem set is well proven enough out yet, I would start restrictive and open up over time. If you're very confident, you have the vision, you're getting a lot of early traction, open it up, get innovating quick, and yeah, that would be my advice.
There's also a lot of different industries. Sorry, like some industries not doing, doing closed source software isn't really possible anymore. Like try and build a security product in closed source or an infrastructure software product in closed source. It's just not really gonna fly anymore.
Absolutely. Maybe the time's past to even try and to build proprietary software, because the world is just, the infrastructure, especially in security, is open source by its very nature. Fiona, I think you had a comment.
I just want to add, and it may or may not be obvious, but it takes much more than just a piece of software to make a successful business. Even if it's a good piece of software, even if it's great code, it takes more to make a successful business. And I mean, just because of every one of us can get access to baking ingredients doesn't mean that any one of us can make a successful bakery, right? Because it takes a lot more than just the I mean, even if you can bake a croissant, doesn't mean that you can make a successful bakery, right? Because it takes more. You need the marketing, you need the reach to customers, you need the customers to know about you and engage with you to actually buy your product, and you can innovate from there to make better products, etc., etc. So there's I mean, I advise lots of startup founders, and the very early stage startups, they usually have this fear that, oh, I've got this great idea, what if somebody takes it? But I can promise you the idea itself doesn't do it, right? You can have tons of good ideas. It takes a lot more to make it an actual successful business. So don't be so afraid of who knows or doesn't know about your idea. If you can make it a successful business, just go and do it. There's not a lot of competition in actually making it a successful business.
I could not agree with that more. Yeah, and just to pick up on some of the other points that have been made, obviously the community, when you put the open source software out there, not only are they users, they're also your product managers, your potential customers, your friends, your community, your supporters. I mean, we got so much value out of getting software out of the door sooner and making it open, because that enabled us to iterate quickly and then start to think about product past that. So just coming on to that point, assuming you now have got a successful open source project, and you're starting to think about commercializing it, what do you do next? Do you like, what model, like how do you think about commercializing it? Like what goes through your mind? Like which model do you choose? Like this is a really tricky point at this point, because there's so many different avenues. There's open core software as a service. Do you try and close source part of the code? Do you create bolt-ons? I mean, what are you thinking about at this point?
I think there's a few things. I think the first thing to do, I think it's really important to have a clean model that everyone understands about what you're going to do. I mean, so like some of the like GitHub's original model was like, GitHub is free for open source, paid if you want to have private repos. Very simple to understand. It seems fair. Fairness is very important for when you're talking with developers. They don't like you to just upsell one feature because it thinks they like, because that's going to force me to buy the product. They don't like things like that. They like a fair model. I think there are some areas where there's now very clear things, like in the last 5 years, it turns out that no one really wants to operate a database, because the upside's not very great, and the downside's you lose all your data and it's a massive disaster. And so if you've seen, almost no one operates their own database now, whereas 5 years ago, everyone operated their own databases because it was kind of the option. But so if you're doing something with like data storage and retention, like or difficult scaling, like there's very few people who really want to operate it. So SaaS is a really great option there. Another thing to do is not try and monetize the actual successful open source project itself, but have a complementary product that people have to buy if they're using this seriously. So a piece that does the security parts that's not part of the open source project has clearly separately defined. The open source project can go and do things in its own way. There's not kind of barrier about someone wanting to add those features necessarily to the open source project on its own, which is often an issue where you try and have a feature add a security, have a closed source security feature that goes with an open source project is often someone will come along and implement it, and it'll be a difficult conversation. But if it's in a separate product that is standalone and your buyers want to buy, that's actually a much easier model as well.
I think it's a really good point to be clear with your community of users as to exactly what you're doing, how you're going to do it, because if there's any gray areas, I've seen that go very badly in some cases. So that being upfront, clear, communicative, transparent, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to do it. I think that's a really important point to make, Justin. Thank you. Sam, I think you...
I 100% agree. I think the general thesis I have is if the things that commoditize your core mission should be your open core. And so like if you believe strongly that the world needs to be better because X is now frictionless and you're putting X out there, then that's your open core. Anything that's allowing enterprises to use that in a positive business outcome is when you start thinking about shared value. And they've created value using the things that you've given them. And so that would be how I would consider bringing a pricing model into it.
I don't think there's a perfect model though for building open source businesses. Like you look, so you mentioned open SaaS, right? And particularly around like scaling databases. This is like I think I'm on my fourth one now. It's very hard work, but like there's a contradiction in that we talked about making open source projects easy to use, easy to adopt. And then we talked about scaling databases being hard and therefore open source databases fitting an open SaaS model. Like we found this with a lot of our projects where we're kind of motivated almost to not invest in making the open source easy because that's where we're adding value. And so open SaaS I found to be a little bit challenging. And open core, like we've talked about, like keeping some features closed when they're particularly relevant to enterprises, for instance. But like typically businesses go down the route of keeping security features closed. I don't think that's acceptable anymore. Like I don't think security is an optional extra that you should pay for. Like I think security should be built into every open source project. And software supply chain security is really, really important nowadays. So there's no one size fits all. Like it's a terrible answer again, but like you've got to find the nuances in your project. What makes your community different? What makes your project different? And then leverage them. For Grafana, it's the enterprise integrations with like Datadog, right? If you're paying for a monitoring vendor, you pay for the integration with Grafana, and that seems to hit that kind of fairness note with the community really well, right? With a lot of our other stuff, we choose like subtle open core, but in general, we tend to err on the side of making most things open. Default to open, be very, very selective with what you keep closed, because it's honestly, the bits you keep closed might just be enough to persuade a business to buy it, but that's all you really need.
Some great points there, Tom. Thanks. Fiona, anything you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, again, from a scientific perspective, if your user base are scientists, then the bit that they would like to see open and that you have most advantage in open sourcing is the key algorithmic bits. That's the core calculation, for example, which is relevant for the scientific outcome. And then the rest of it, you can keep it closed because nobody cares, right? But making that core calculation bit open is what gives you also the trust with your user base, that they know, okay, yeah, I can see how you're calculating this and I trust these calculations, so I'm going to use this product. They don't care whether the rest of the roundabout of the database and user interface, whether all of that is open source, it doesn't matter as much.
Does anyone have any experience in creating closed sourced features on top of the open source projects and then open sourcing them over time? And if you have, why would you maybe consider that as a potential route?
Yeah, we did this we did it in MongoDB. I was responsible for Compass originally, which was the developer interface. And we started off making that as a closed source tool, and we open sourced it over time. And really what we thought was, by open sourcing it, we sort of end up making people more successful with MongoDB, which is our core mission. We wanted more people to use Mongo, and how do you make them more successful is give them the tooling they need to be successful. And so we ended up open sourcing it. We ended up actually building an extensible framework so you could plug things into Compass, your own, plugins, and make it extensible to do things that we probably were not going to do for a couple of years based on the roadmap we had. And so that kind of innovation actually really accelerated a lot of cool stuff for Compass. And it comes back to my point from the previous question, which was, if it commoditizes your core mission, open source it and build an open core around it. And if it's like somebody's getting a business value out of it, then consider it paid.
There is a model that I've never been in a company that anyone used, but I think it's kind of interesting, where you commit on a timeline to releasing code open source like X year, say 2 years after you release the proprietary version. That's designed to incentivize people not in the community not to implement those features because they're coming down the wire later anyway, but also to incentivize you to keep shipping new features that differentiate. It's not a very common strategy, but I think there are things like that you can do if you want to sort of have that kind of rolling commit. But I think that only works, if for certain kinds of product again.
Thanks very much for those. In people talking, it just made me think about this concept of competition and building these features and the value of it, and so on. And just from my personal experience, actually don't worry so much about creating an open source project and then suddenly someone forking it and becoming a competitor. I think it very rarely happens. And from my own experience, if you're really active in your own project and you're actually leading it and maintaining it, and you're going to be doing all the work around it and creating that business, like Fiona, like you mentioned, then you're going to be sort of seen as the maintainers and the people that the company that people go to. But one of the threats that's sort of grown over the past few years, especially in open source, has been the cloud companies and sort of how they might take that open source software from a position of incredible power and growth, and then maybe create a service themselves. Should potential founders in the open source space be worried about the cloud vendors and thinking about how they should be developing some of these features to try and either avoid that from happening, or should they be throwing the lots in with the open source, so the big cloud vendors, and saying, let's create this service together? Because it's so much of what's happening around these open source business models at the moment is changing so rapidly because of the strength of various different vendors and like the various different interests from various different parties, plus the open source community, plus the venture capital that's going to open source. Does anyone have any perspective on how we play fairly, or how they play fairly with the open source code that we're creating?
I mean, I think the cloud vendors are an existential threat to the open source business model. I don't think it's too controversial to say that. But I think a lot of open source businesses are unwilling to engage with the big cloud vendors, right? And I think when you actually find, and get to know them and start working with them, you find they're actually just big groups of engineers, very similar to ourselves, who know what they're doing and are looking for a way to work together, and there are relationships and business partnerships to be done there. We have a very strong relationship with Amazon around the Grafana project and help them build their hosted Grafana service and have a monetary relationship around it. I quite enjoy working with that team. And I think they do a great job, and they do have a huge advantage when it comes to channel and don't have the same level of expertise in building and working with Grafana and operating it at scale. So there is an exchange to be made. But I do think you've got to be careful, right? You 100% got to be careful. And the big thing you've got to do when you go into those negotiations and go into those relationships is kind of know what you've got and know what you can help them with. At Grafana, we had some differentiation, right? There were some features that weren't part of the open source. We had the trademark, we had the copyright on the code. We had all of these kind of things, all of this stuff that we could offer in exchange, right? And that's what put us in that position. And I feel like if you go into that either in a weak position without any of those protections in place, or you go into it maybe demanding a bit too much and not realizing your hand, then it can all go particularly south.
Thanks, Tom. Any other perspectives or comments anyone would like to make on this? I was avoiding the question.
No, I think if you ask anybody in any industry, is that the big cloud vendors are an existential threat for everyone doing anything. We sort of built our theories or ethos or hypotheses a bit around this, which is and we've lived this experience ourselves. I've built products in the past on, managed services in the cloud and big cloud vendors. And what you see is at scale, they don't work particularly well. There's a sort of like variety of things in the app catalogs that they have that of a variety of different qualities. And ultimately what you want to do is you want to bring a bunch of things in-house and be able to have the flexibility to deploy certain parts as a managed service, certain parts as self-hosted, and be able to move between clouds as you go. And so I do think we're sort of like at this weird re-centralization point right now, where the internet had started as something that might lead to further decentralization and has pulled us all back together into sort of like big three. And then now we're starting to proliferate out, or will start to proliferate out again in terms of flexibility. So I think people are looking, I would not build anything in mind to say this is 100% going to be for the big cloud vendors to be distributed and I'm just going to work with them, etc. It's like build your product in the way you think people are going to want to use your product. If it's multi-cloud, cross-cloud, some part of it is in-house, you want the flexibility to move it around, that's how I would focus on it. And I think if you do that, at least then you've addressed a whole swath of people out there that are innovating in a space that is, traditionally been quite full of friction in terms of deployment in-house, right? It's a lot of effort to build things in-house. That's why you typically push things out into the cloud and use infrastructure out there, but it's getting easier day by day.
Yeah, and to your point, Sam, we are starting to see a multi-cloud world, aren't we, in these enterprises? They're all using multiple environments, and then they're not going to go away from on-prem for a long, long time, if ever. And obviously we have edge as well. So there is going to be value for people who can create that sort of consistent service across these multiple environments. So yeah. I think that's a point that I kind of felt like I heard you make there. So that's something that people should remember. There's always going to need to be a Switzerland, and maybe that's the vendors themselves. But we have obviously seen some like reactions to sort of the strength of the cloud, and that has been in some license changes. Another one that we personally went through is, should people consider maybe donating code to a foundation? I mean, we actually donated Cert Manager to the CNCF. Has anyone considered like license changes or actually donating code to the CNCF, and why would you or why would you not?
Yeah, I mean, we've donated quite a bit of code to the CNCF, and we created the OCI as a standards organization around our own code because we were in a position where Docker became a de facto standard, and then people wanted to understand that standard wasn't very well documented, and we wanted to kind of bring that standard out in the world and make it a standard that everyone was clear what the governance process was and things like that. So so we've done a lot of that. I think standards are an important part of the openness, and you should consider them alongside your things. Which parts of your offering are around standards, which things should you create standards around. Interoperability is really important with some parts, and people and one of the things about open source is not having lock-in. So all those things are really useful things to think about in terms of working with an organization. It also, it does give you that commit on what's open for, what's open forever. You can't take it back if you give it to a standard. So it sends a signal that you can't really do on your own often. And so it does help to, for people to understand where you're trying to commercialize, where you're not trying to commercialize, and making that clearer.
Thanks, Justin. Fiona, any perspective on this? No, Tom?
Yeah, I think the CNCF is great for encouraging collaboration. If you work together with other organizations and companies on the same project, then getting that governance nice and square under the CNCF is a real big strength, right? I do, to Justin's point, like once you've given it to CNCF, you can't take it back. To my earlier point about dealing with the cloud vendors, like giving it to the CNCF involves a trademark donation, involves a copyright donation, right? You're assigning it over to them. And so it does weaken your hand, right? And if you intend to commercialize that project, it's going to be much harder. And you've effectively made it easier for the cloud vendors to use that project and commercialize it themselves.
But then you also, on the other hand, possibly with the strength of the CNCF, create a standard that lots of the industry are going to start to standardize on. And
Of course, yeah. And, getting a project into
reach, yeah, and make the project more successful.
Getting into the CNCF is a huge boost for a project, right? I know the CNCF, we try very hard not to be kingmakers, right? Not to bless one project over another. But to some extent, it's inevitable that getting a project into the CNCF is a big stamp of approval.
And there are a lot of successful businesses running on out of CNCF projects, either theirs or indeed other people's projects.
Indeed.
There's a question here actually from Massey. How would you propose working with the CNCF and having engineering councils to work in collaboration with them to help make these standards? I mean, Tom and Justin, in your roles in the CNCF, you've probably got some good advice there.
Get out there and start, writing code and working with other people is really the starting point. I mean, almost every new project coming to the CNCF now is, 3 or 4 companies getting together, and because they want to work on something together, or it's somebody's project that's gaining a bunch of adoption and they want to get more. But a lot of it is just people wanting to work together on some kind of standard or some kind of tool or some piece that they need consensus on, and to build something together with other people in the industry.
And I just add that, like, real standards emerge, like they're not defined, right? Like, if you get a bunch of people together to write a standard, you're going to get something that's pretty awful. But if like OCI, right, you actually base a standard on working code, shipping code that's widely used, and it emerges and then gets blessed, right, as the standard. That's how standards evolve. So I wouldn't necessarily engage in committees. I would build stuff and ship it and get users.
Rough consensus and working code, as
exactly, yeah.
As IETF says.
That's great. Any more questions from the from participants at this point? Please stick them in the chat. If so, we're starting to come up to the last 5 minutes or so. I guess I'll just wait for another minute or so. If not, so I guess we've had some really great discussion here. I think if we want to start thinking about wrapping up, if you're someone out there who's really interested in starting a business around in the open source space and building a product, can we just go around the panelists and just give that 1 or 2 pieces of advice that you think would be most relevant or important to that individual? I think I'll start with Tom.
I want to reiterate something Justin said earlier, right? The most successful open source project that I started was Loki, our log aggregation system. And I built that because I wanted something to aggregate my logs. Like, it's that simple. Like, there was no precondition. I wasn't trying to build a competitor to anyone. I wasn't trying to build a business. I wanted a tool that I could use to view my dev logs from my pods. And so scratch your own itch, right? Build a successful project, think about how to commercialize it later.
Thanks, Tom. Sam?
100%. Scratch your own itch. I think your community is everything. Nurture it, treat it very well, understand who's in your community, find ways for them to meet each other, network, and let it grow. That's going to be the most critical thing.
Thanks, Sam. Fiona?
I want to add to that I would say your community is not everything. Basically, that if you have a great active community, a big active community, that's great, and you can benefit a lot from that. But you cannot disregard. You need to make sure that your team keeps contributing and being the most active developers. You can't suddenly say, "Oh, it's a big active community. They will all contribute all the bug fixes," and no, you're not relying on your community to do your development for you. You are doing the development, you make a successful product, and you do the commercialization. If you also have a great community around it, that's great. That's just an added benefit.
Interesting perspective. That's great. Thanks, Fiona. And Justin?
Well, I would say, actually, following on from that, one of the massive benefits as a startup in having an open source project is it gives you people to hire, because you hire the top contributors. And that's actually, like, every startup does it, and people don't always realize that it's a huge benefit. You'll find some people who are like, this is cool, I'm going to contribute, and then down the road, those are your greatest employees. And you know, we got a lot of people like that. We still do. It's still an amazing way of finding people who are already engaged and have the right skills and are interested in what and excited in what you're doing. And that's like, it's often challenging to hire people. And so like just that benefit of open source is amazing.
That's great. Thanks, Justin. And just a quick follow up to that for you, Justin. For those people that might not be quite ready to start a business in open source, but they just want to get involved in the open source community, where should they go?
I mean, I think there's so many open source communities. It's like, you know, find something that you're interested in. You know, find a project that needs help. There are so many projects that that need help and you know, that just have work to do. There's, you know, everyone open source projects are, you know, that are projects still and not companies, are just they're a great place to learn about how software works and how things use. And again, like the scratching your itch thing, it's so important to be engaged in the thing that you're working on, and then you'll discover more things from there. It's the like hardly anyone creates an open source business with something that they're not really not deeply engaged in and excited by every day, and see the possibilities that are out there in that world. You know, it's like, you know, if you look at all the things we've done, we've all gone to businesses because we're excited by the things that they're doing and the things they're working on, and that, you know, that's open source just gives you so many opportunities to find those things that you didn't realize you were excited by, that could be anywhere in the world. There's only, you know, often you find with a new project that there's only 3 people in the world who find it exciting, and you're one of them. And that's like amazing, because that's the beginning of that. In a few years' time, there could be thousands, but right now it's you found the 3 people in the world who are most excited by this one thing.
And it's a good point to remember, like, you know, not everyone's creating business around this. I mean, you look at what happened with Log4j and Heartbleed and so on and so forth. So often you find that some of these projects that have grown to become the backbone of lots of these enterprises' software infrastructure is actually held together by a few people just who are really passionate about the software. But it's it's a fascinating world. I love the world of open source. It's changing all the time. It's really exciting. There's loads going on in it. And thank you so much for the advice on building a product to the panelists. It's been great having you. And these are the types of people you could actually get access to directly as part of the mentorship program. So please contact us and get involved. We want to find more open source businesses and help people along that journey. Thanks so much for all of the participants for joining. This will be recorded and put out on the Open UK website. And I wish you all the best for your Friday afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Oh, yeah. Come next week. Next week, 12 o'clock for Amanda's session on licensing. Thanks all. And corporate governance. Yeah, we can't forget that.